Swale, Siam, Siaya, Tsandlia Telsqui, Talitsaquah Chilquick, Talitsaquah Skowkale. Hello, my name is Tsandlia, and I am from Chilquick Territory and from Skowkale. I'm acknowledging the territory that I call home. Chilquick Territory is located up the Fraser River in the eastern Fraser Valley of British Columbia, Canada. By acknowledging where I come from, I am connecting myself to thousands of years of tradition, the land that my ancestors have been stewards of, and my truth. Humans are inextricably linked to one another, but have been forced apart due to cultural experiences and colonial narratives. My work as an educator began well before I was aware, as I began to create a sense of who I was and what my truth is. My work continues now as I question, how can I acknowledge and elevate the lived experiences and cultural backgrounds of my students? They are, after all, living, breathing curriculum, and they bring with them so many stories. We teach who we are what we teach. My maternal ancestors are Stalo and are intimately connected to the land that I call my home. On my paternal side, my father is a Dutch settler. I live in a very interesting space that I'm still trying to make sense of. On one side, I have very strong Stalo ties, and on the other, I'm a settler Canadian. I've garnered ways to navigate my world by bringing forward pieces of both. I am not only a proud Stalo woman exploring what it means to be Hwalmuk, but I also acknowledge that I grew up in Canada on the foundations of colonial displacement, cultural genocide, and Western worldviews. I bring these identities with me when I teach. My learning journey centers around the teachings embedded in Shokuyam, our oral histories. In my early undergraduate years, I spent time as a researcher, and summers were spent in libraries and archives listening to interviews from early ethnographers. These interviews were with incredibly significant knowledge keepers. Our knowledge keepers are highly respected for their ability to share, teach, and carry our culture. We as Stalo come from an oral tradition that connects us to others and to the land around us. I urge anyone I come across to get to know knowledge keepers in your area and to listen to what they have to share and hold those teachings close. Through this process of research, which I acknowledge and remind you is a very Western way of learning, I began to feel a massive amount of responsibility because these knowledge keepers were sharing their world and their being with the interviewer and indirectly me. Shokuyam is our way to transmit the teachings about our beginnings as a people and the beginnings of our land. Shokuyam instructs us on how to respect our land and acknowledge the spaces that connect us. The Shokuyam also help us to use active listening. Listeners not only use their ears, they use their mind and their heart. I return to my previous mention of research and its very strong connection to Western ways of being and determining what and who education is for. Indigenous educators and academics across the world are working extremely hard to redefine and reestablish what education looks like for our people. So, what is the purpose of education, and how does that relate to culturally responsive teaching practices? I'll start with my journey to becoming an educator. I asked myself, why do we need to share knowledge with young learners? What is integral to their development in this world? To answer these seemingly immense questions, my mentors suggested looking inward. We explore who we are and the identity that we carry with us and develop a sense of purpose within our work. And it's that willingness that makes us strong educators. For me, this purpose was to help students to develop their ability to learn from one another and from the world around them. The culture and teachings within our society is embedded within the people that surround us. If only we could tap into these knowledges. Developing the skills needed to do this comes from us, the educators. This does require some deconstruction on what and who we think education is for. I've come to recognize the immense impact of colonialism on not only my family, but also the society in which I live. The world that I grew up in is very different than the Stalo world that I live in and learn from now. We also have a responsibility to remember that our generations are still living with the trauma and influences of the residential school system. This system removed children from their homes and communities to systematically deny them from their culture and language. Settler colonialism is a purposeful, violent act, and it's a way of being and navigating our world. And it has deep implications on what we think education is for. I grew up in an educational environment that didn't allow me to bring my cultural identity into the classroom. For generations, our classrooms have continued to reinforce worldviews that negate our Stalo ways of being. An example of these approaches to knowledge is the language that we use and our practices of bringing diversity into the classroom. Diversity is a Eurocentric white word, and it's about making sense of, through a white lens, difference. And by creating, curating, and demanding palatable definitions of diversity. Examples of lived experiences can be incredibly powerful. There's a strong push for culturally diverse literature in our classrooms, and we, meaning educators, cannot put a parameter around what we determine to be diverse. What books and whose voices are going to be shared. We should focus on our students and the stories that they bring to our classrooms. It is a powerful experience to explore our identities and our truth. Our truth is what grounds us in the world, just as I grounded myself when I introduced who I am, where I come from, and the land that I'm connected to. We as educators do a really great job of teaching about different people and places and concepts. But can we move to a place where we are learning from the world around us? When we are learning from others, we are listening to their truth. This is especially important when we're exploring culture. We can build stronger connections when we connect story to a person. The history of erasure and the dehumanization of Indigenous peoples has impacted our ability to forge strong relationships. By learning from the Stalo people, we are opening ourselves up to this process. We open ourselves up to learning through connection. When students practice exploring their own identity, they can then apply these skills of curiosity, empathy, and openness when exploring other stories. How does their story connect to other people's? And how does your story connect to other perspectives? From my Stalo identity, I carry with me the teachings of Shokuyam and Squalqual. We all carry stories, memory, and history with us. And it is those lived experiences that influence our world. In my experiences, culture has been central to my learning. It contributes to the way that we develop communication and interpretations of the world around us and interpretations of each other. We are all cultural beings, and we have cultural backgrounds that influence our perception of the world and therefore constitute who we are as a human being. It is a very real fact that Stalo culture is alive and resilient. We have strongly rooted cultural practices that acknowledge and respect our place in this world as Stalo. So moving forward and away from the way that we've included culture in our classrooms in the past, we need to elevate the lived experiences of our students. I recently had the opportunity within my home community to push our school district in the way we think about Stalo teachings. Beginning with Hwalmuk teachings, names are sacred. They not only identify a person or a place, but they carry massive amounts of history with them. Our names are carried through the generations, and we have a responsibility to uphold and share the teachings that belong to each ancestral name or place name. Our language is another sacred piece of Hwalmuk identity, and deeply embedded in those languages are our ways of being. A new school is being built in the heart of Tilquayak territory, about 1 kilometer or 2 up the Thulwamal River, near Steetaws, where the Promontory Mountain meets the Vetter Mountain. What a perfect opportunity to elevate the culture and identity of our Stalo students so that community members can explore and learn from the Stalo people. My experiences with colonialism have prevented me from learning my ancestral language. Knowing the significance of our language and the teachings embedded in our Shokuyam, I know that the longer we continue to not elevate Indigenous languages, the longer we continue to determine what is acceptable diversity. Moving forward, after generations of systemic racism, oppression, and discriminatory policy against Indigenous people, this school can hopefully provide an immediate space for Stalo students to have a sense of belonging. By elevating their lived experiences, culture, and language, we are saying that you determine what is important to your cultural identity, not us. Your lived experiences are not being placed below any others. When we teach from a position that elevates the stories and lived experiences, we acknowledge and respect that each student is a cultural being, and we don't determine for them what diversity looks like. They bring their experiences into the classroom, and it enhances our learning from each other. I'm going to leave you with this thought. My experiences are very context specific and directly relate to the territory in which I live. But ultimately, I want us as human beings to think of the communities we could create if only we stepped away from our palatable definitions of diversity and looked to move forward together to build shared understanding and build equity within our communities. Lahai, I'm finished.